the house is on fire, and we need people who are willing to pick up a bucket of water and start doing something.
I think that the only way for this nation to have a bright future where there's stability and there's like a sensible usage of power is for the federal government to collapse. Like, I'm actually kind of banking on that.
From GBH News, this is Not My Politics. I'm Zoe Mathews. Today, party politics is turning people off from voting. Young people especially report staggering levels of distrust in the way our political systems function. And while our national politics has shifted to the right, identity crises abound on both sides of the aisle. I'm joined by Alex, a 25-year-old Boston resident who ran for mayor last year with a long-shot mayoral campaign, and Kunal Botla, a 21-year-old Lexington town meeting member, I believe the youngest sitting town meeting member in the town. You both come at politics from a left-of-center perspective, but there's some difference in party alignment here, so I want to get into that a little bit. Kunal, you're a registered Democrat. You're organizing for the Markey re-election campaign. Alex, last time we talked, you told me that you don't want the stink of Democrats on any of your work and your organizing. What turned you off from engaging with the Democratic Party while you were sort of deciding that you wanted to get politically involved?
I think the disillusionment was a long time coming before I was even an adult. I came over illegally from Mexico, so that immigration status has always been front of mind as I grew up, especially as I was making my way through the education system. I was very fortunate to have a bunch of educational programs in Boston, help me get into a private school just south of Boston, Milton Academy, and there I think is really where I solidified my opposition to the two-party political system in the country. And when I say the stink of Democrats, I don't mean like the everyday Democratic aligned voter. I mean the Democratic establishment, the people who keep power in the politics running, who's selecting the candidates for different Senate offices, that sort of stuff. When I was in high school, that was like the first cycle of Trump running for office, so it was Trump versus Hillary. And I was seeing how the candidates were being discussed. Trump, he was being kind of whitewashed already, like in the present term. His lies were being called half-truths or falsehoods or whatever. Like, they weren't just calling him out directly. And then I was seeing how Hillary was being presented as kind of like the saving grace of the nation. Sure, she was definitely way better than Trump, definitely more qualified. She had those experiences in offices across the levels of government. But she herself was emblematic of what I saw was the decline in American politics and American society at large. Just like the traditional liberal democratic policies that kind of paint over acute suffering at the lowest levels by presenting a whole that was succeeding, specifically how we relate to the rest of the world through our economies, because I think like that's a big part about the liberal economic ideology that conservatives also buy into as well. They like the cheap goods that they're getting from across the world, but they don't want to think about how that leads to mass immigration or how that causes instability that then affects the U.S. So that's kind of where my disillusionment came from, just understanding that neither of these parties were really going to advocate for the long-term health of the nation.
Yeah, you're not alone in that assessment. The Harvard Youth Poll, the spring polling results this year, show that there's a real loss of faith in the party system sort of across young people. This youth poll surveys people under age 30, and it found that approval for both parties among young people, both Democrats and Republicans, is in the mid-20s right now, which is pretty low, and only a third of people surveyed say that they believe that the midterms will even be free and fair at all. To me, that feels like kind of crisis numbers on America's 250th year. But Kunal, I think you have a different assessment maybe of where we are as a country. I know that you were out on July 4th reading the Declaration of Independence on Lexington Common as part of the town's celebratory parties. So I just want to hear from you a little bit about where you think American politics is right now.
I think we're at a really challenging time. I think right now we're seeing, that disillusionment, that kind of isolation, and we're seeing that separation of things. But I think at the same time, we're at a moment where we're starting to get to some of the fundamental things that people are interested in, in terms of housing cost, in terms of, just cost of living and being able to survive and go on that like day-to-day basis. And I think that's where local government is super, super influential, because that's the government that's determining exactly what is taught in the schools. How long the library is open, how long you have access to resources at the public works building, how quickly the roads get paved or how quickly a pothole gets filled, and when the trash gets picked up. And I think things like that are where a lot of influence lies right now, especially when not very much is happening in Congress, not very much is happening federally. A lot has kind of stagnated. I think it's very important that we have folks and are, working on things that start impacting people's day-to-day lives. I think thinking back to, specifically reading the Declaration of Independence, I think we're at a very interesting time in American history because we're celebrating this like 250th anniversary, of quote unquote freedom of independence. But we have a very storied history here in the U.S. The independence that was achieved on July 4th, 1776 is not the form of independence or freedom that we're looking to, achieve and strive for today. And I think that progression is really important to acknowledge, that we've had so many changes in American history and so many moments where things have changed really critically and really fundamentally. On July 4th, 1776, the independence was really just for white landowning men. And that's a definition that's expanded to a much broader, still not perfect segment of the population now.
So you're taking the stance of the party is progress is slow, but the moral arc sort of is always towards justice. And you have faith still in this system that a lot of your peers don't. So what gives you that faith about staying as a registered Democrat, as working within the system?
I think we have to be working in every part of the system, not just the White House, because, an executive order can only go so far. The president can only do so much on their own. And I think making sure that we have even individual Congress people, members in the House and the Senate who are advocating and fighting back and, fighting for justice federally is just one step below that. But then thinking about states, we have 50 states in the US, and then we have countless major cities, smaller cities, towns across the country. And those, levels on the ladder are where a lot of the really important decision making and really important policy is taking place. Like, I think thinking, back to 2022, the Fair Share Amendment here in Massachusetts was a huge step forward in terms of taking our flat tax system and creating a fair share for people who are making millions of dollars, over $1 million per year, and start investing those funds into education, towards free community college, free school lunches, and infrastructure on transportation. And I think things like that don't really require the White House's buy-in, regardless of which party the White House is held by at a given point. Those types of policies where we're able to make really meaningful steps forward and impact people's lives directly are huge.
I do want to push back a little bit on something you said earlier, right at the beginning of your answer, about how Congress isn't really doing a lot right now, or not a lot is happening, because where I'm sitting as a journalist, it feels like a lot has happened in the past year and a half. You've got some Supreme Court decisions. I know you were talking about executive orders, but then they go through the system, and our functioning system of democracy is working slowly, and we have to wait for the courts to make their decision. But a lot sort of all happened at once in the past couple of months. So a lot of change is happening. So I guess, I don't know, either of you, I'm wondering how do you respond to that change when a lot of people our age say the party isn't responding fast enough?
I think the rapidness of this change kind of proves my point that we can change things fundamentally for better in our societies if we want to. And you just see how fast things happen, how fast technology has spread, how fast these resources, these products come into our lives. We have the capacity, we have the industrial capacity, the intellectual knowledge to make these changes radically happen. But it seems like it only happens towards like negative things or to the accumulation of power. And that is by design. That's how our country was set up. Kunal talked about how independence and freedom, that definition has changed from the beginning, because who was given that freedom at the start? Landowning white men. And that pattern is built into the way that this nation functions. So like the changes that happen rapidly cause mass damage to everybody else because a single unified group is benefiting. Different people align themselves that aren't within that identity. You could be a gay person who aligns yourself with white supremacy, for example. But yeah, I think this just shows to me that if we want to, we can make this change happen. And it's just about how do you give people that hope and like let them know that they have capacity to do things. And I think that's why I start with like the small stuff, the things that people can see every single day, because that's how it all builds up. You can worry about national politics, but like you as a person, you're like, what do I do? You can worry about so many global issues that are happening. And again, what do I do as a single person? It's about the small actions that build up over time. And then there's an emergent property that happens when a bunch of those small actions get together.
I do want to talk about sort of the the big news in the Democratic Party, which is Graham Plattner in Maine. I think he has officially filed the paperwork to remove himself from the race after sexual assault allegations. I'm just curious about the sense of a harm to credibility to the party that this whole situation sort of brings up. It feels to me like the Democrats were a little desperate, and that after 2024, I didn't really see the same sort of response that we saw after 2016 of this real mobilization in the streets. And yes, we have the No Kings protest, and those are sort of one-off days where people really come together and show their support and unity in opposition, but then everyone sort of just goes back to their jobs. And there is this sense that the Democratic Party maybe hadn't had to respond to those left insurgent wings of the party, but maybe they felt, oh crap, we need to do something. Populism is getting a little more popular, and we need to harness that. And it kind of spectacularly backfired for them in Maine. So I'm just sort of wondering your both assessments on what happened there.
I think, thinking about the 2024 election and how we move forward, I think a huge thing is that we need results. We need people who are delivering on things and actually solving problems. I think that's why Michelle Wu has, kind of built that reputation she has in Boston. I mean, her first term, her second term look a little bit different. But, as a counselor, as council president, she really built this reputation of being an on-the-ground advocate and being someone directly engaged with the community. And I think in New York, Zohran Mamdani did the same thing, especially with this campaign, getting media out there, getting communication out there, and really reaching voters. But then both of them also have the educational and experiential background to really back what they're saying, either from, legal training or their undergraduate degree that gave them direct training in it. And I think that's influential. I think that's impactful. I think we really need to think about exactly how we're finding candidates, because I think it makes a lot of sense for an assemblyman who has had, who's found success in, advocating with groups advocating with groups that aren't heard as often, advocating with unions, taxi drivers, and elevating them to the mayor's office makes sense. Someone who's on Boston City Council, understands the system, and is running for mayor, that makes a lot of sense. But I think I worry a little bit about outside groups coming in. Like I was looking at the Wall Street Journal article where they interviewed the two kind of political consultants that brought Graham Plattner in.
Right.
And it's a little concerning, how they talk about their candidate, how they talk about and how they respond to if they knew that he had these sexual harassment allegations or sexual assault allegations even later on, or the tattoo or anything as part of, the process. It was a very weird interview. And I think that's different, having someone come from completely left field versus someone who's involved in the community and is now running for office. And I think if you go back in American history, you see a lot of really successful and really impactful legislators who've done great work because they know what's happening on the ground from being a community advocate, but they're not part of the classic political, they're not the lieutenant governor and then running for governor, but they're coming from another office.
Alex, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I have a few different angles to look at this at. First, looking at how the Democratic Party establishment responded to the race, because obviously Plattner was not their first choice. But people very decidedly told them they did not want a long-term old person going into 6 years in the Senate. So Janet Mills' campaign was kind of undone by that. And I think it speaks to how much people are looking for this kind of radical change, that they were willing to pass a bunch of warning signs that came up early during Plattner's campaign. And then also the point that Kunal brought up, these consultants that then come in, again, goes back to my point that this country was made for the elite control of certain classes of people. These are the people who are raising these candidates up. And I think it's also interesting to throw in Bernie Sanders as well, because he's kind of seen as the paragon of leftist activism and politics in this country. But again, to my point about how old these people are, and this is why I call this country an oligarchy, because oligos means the few. This is a country that's ruled by the few. Bernie Sanders is just way too old to be in Congress. He's way too old to be making these decisions that kind of backfire spectacularly. And you can bring this back even more locally to Massachusetts. I know you're campaigning for Ed Markey, but again, on the grounds that he is just so old. He's spent half a century in Congress, both as a representative and as a senator. To me, that's kind of, again, representative of the fact that this country is run by the few people. That's half a century right there. That's 20% of the nation's history this man has been in Congress. He hasn't made the space for another person to take up after him. I think that's a failure of the Democratic Party. You're not finding that talent. You're not training them. It's kind of like a very self-centered, like, I am the person who's going to save this party, save the state, save the seat, flip the Senate. There's like no collective well-being that's being considered here, because there's so many people better than Ed Markey. I'm sure he knows plenty of them, and he hasn't raised them up to that level. I just don't think that we should be allowing these people, just because they're proven to continue to take power that other people have proven themselves to be able to wield better and more effectively.
Did either of you guys see the Globe article where they interviewed, I think it was people as old as Markey or older than him, and there was like an 81-year-old woman who was like, I just think he's a little too old to be in the Senate. So obviously, even people of older generations are like, yeah, I don't think I could hack it. I don't think I could do it. I don't think they should have that power.
And then you have Mitch McConnell, who's been on like a health scare for a month at this point, right? And then Donald Trump is visibly degrading in office, and nobody does anything about it. And we want to keep electing these people into office. Elizabeth Warren, our other senator, is going to be over the 80 by the time her third term finishes.
Kunal, do you want to respond to the age question?
Yeah, I think, right now we're looking at age a lot, which makes sense. It's an understandable thing as we're seeing so much generational shift. But I think another big thing to consider is that not all young people are looking out for young people and looking for solutions for young people. I mean, just going back to this race in Massachusetts, I think we have two candidates. We have Ed Markey, who's been a proven fighter. He's been an advocate. He's been, an ally for a lot of the advocacy that we've wanted to push forward in Massachusetts, and he's delivered on it. He got a lot of things for clean energy, for energy independence in the IRA, things that, are, really impactful, but are limited in their capability with the Trump administration. He was a big advocate for the housing bill that just passed, the bipartisan housing bill. But then if you jump to the other candidate, Representative Moulton is branding himself as the most progressive Democrat in Massachusetts and skipped the vote on the housing bill, which I think is just the kind of like culture and attitude that we don't want to see from our members of Congress. People who are elected to represent, he's elected to represent the 6th district in Massachusetts, but he didn't vote. And I think things like that are especially risky. He invests in companies that come before his committee. He, I think represents a generation of Democrats that I think we need to leave behind, especially as we're seeing so much change. So I think even more than, anything else, how they stand on issues is huge for me.
I think the way that you frame this race kind of exemplifies another problem I have with the Democratic Party establishment, that this race is being framed as something between these two candidates when there are other candidates who are in the field, but they don't have that kind of backing of the establishment. Like, they don't want to bow down to the Democratic Party's policies, and they're not being included in this conversation.
There is another candidate
Joe
in the
Teche,
race who's running as a socialist, I believe.
yes,
He's a member
yes.
of the Party for Socialism and Liberation.
So, like, all the policies you say that you like that Marquez advance, he would advance them, and he's proven himself to do that. He's affiliated with parties who make this their entire mission. So, I think that we need to be able to look beyond the party establishment to find people who are willing to serve this nation.
I do want to continue and maybe talk about somewhat of an elephant in the room of the Democratic Party right now, which is we're talking about male candidates exclusively. And I do think, a lot of the conversation online over the Graham-Plattner debate was like, well, we maybe not would have had this problem if we just found some female candidates to run. I am sort of thinking about the masculinity angle of our modern politics, and you see the manosphere on the right, and you see like Hassan Piker in a tight suit on the left, and it just sort of feels like what he's like twitching his way to political influence. I'm curious how you both, as young men, are internalizing this moment.
I think it's tough. I mean, I was a high school student relatively recently, even during the pandemic. And, sometimes I get invited to speak to high school clubs. There are high school students who reach out to me just because I'm that most accessible town meeting member, that most accessible person in Lexington's government. And, you can DM me on Instagram. I don't think you can do that with the chair of the Appropriations Committee. And I think it's different. Things have changed. The way high school students, young people are thinking about politics have just fundamentally changed.
Tell me how.
I think people are looking for, a quick catchphrase. They're looking for things that are easy to digest, easy to understand, and they are less concerned about what some people's actual policies are sometimes even. And then on the other side of things, there are people who are political junkies, in 10th grade as a sophomore in high school, and they are figuring out the minute differences about how someone's voted, what types of things they've said, going back in meeting minutes. And I think that range
Was that you?
is huge. I'm not in high school. I mean, when I started getting involved more in government, yeah, I was looking back and how the people I was, working with, the folks I was running against, were doing things. But I think looking in the congressional record was not something I really did in high school. But I think that spectrum of things, the fact that there are so many people who are engaged at varying levels, but then also don't necessarily show up to a protest, don't necessarily come out, but the folks who do come out to every single protest, I think is a challenge we really have to reconcile and work with. I think we need much better communication from government itself, from people in government. I think see it like a communication that's actually explaining what's happening. The days of when we send out a warrant for a town meeting in Lexington, it's mailed to every address it's mailed to every dwelling unit. And it starts with to the constables of the town of Lexington. I don't know if the warrant for town meeting is necessarily conveying the information about what the town is considering, the major changes, the investment, the different conversations that the town is having, as much as some of the even like AI generated content on Facebook is driving the conversation. And I think that's somewhere where people who are elected, people who are involved in government need to improve communication, need to be better about getting the true information out there, also in a reasonably digestible way. And, the governments themselves have to be getting information out there. I think back to like the Washington Department of Transportation and how they were using memes to communicate where, road closures were going to be so that people actually understood what was being closed and it wasn't just on the like lit up LED signs on highways. Or how like some states have taken more like humorous approaches to try to prevent drunk driving. But I think we're at a moment where we really have to zoom back and look at how communication, works. And I know, Alex, you've done a lot on social media.
Yeah, that's your whole thing is sort of direct action messaging directly to the people. I did want to sort of go back to the Hassan Piker thing because you were talking about how the communication from the right seems like they're in lockstep more or less all the time. They've got true socials. They're in all caps. It's like very clear what the party messaging is right now. The closest thing I feel like that I've seen to come to at least what the left, it's obviously not the establishment Democrat perspective, but Hassan is messaging in a way that I'm sure the party really wants to know like what his little secret is. But Alex, I'm curious too about going back to that thought about masculinity.
Yeah, since I've been in college, I've been challenging the term identity politics because I feel like it gets thrown around as a recent term, a recent way that people politic in this nation. But that's just the foundation of this government. What is identity politics when you're saying that a person who's black or wasn't born on this land isn't a citizen or isn't entitled to rights? Same thing with female identities. The male identity, their male bias to power is baked into this country. So I think that shows up in a lot in why we don't really see women in office, like even after they were allowed to vote on the federal level. That's 150. That's 150 years of the nation's history where women weren't given access to power on the federal level, and those biases get baked into the way that the country functions. Who gets found into power, and women are also socially conditioned differently. How do you take up space? How do you take power even when you're not qualified? Like, when people are applying to jobs, women are the least likely to apply if they don't meet all the qualifications that are listed, whereas men will do that more often. So there's so many factors that are playing into in why men take up space more, whether that's in social media or in person on the street, like nuisance streamers specifically, like all the ones that I've seen have ended up being men. I think maybe there are one or two female nuisance streamers. But again, like taking up space, claiming power, drawing this attention to yourself is like something that's been very conditioned to the men only.
Do you feel like Democrats or the left in ahead of 2028 should go the sort of Hassan Piker identity politics route? Like, is there a way that we can do politics without cult of personality?
So everyone's doing identity politics right now. I don't think that the Democrats should follow Hassan Piker because I think that tends towards, again, a cult of personality where you can't not necessarily controlled, but there aren't really these checks to people who don't have, like, even if you don't have the experience, like, maybe you should be given a chance. But if your record after being given that chance isn't right, like, if you don't know how to control that, or like send them back down, like, you're not fit to wield this power, I think that's dangerous. I do think that more candidates should be more personable on social media, because that's how you're reaching the most people. And to some extent, I do agree that people are looking for like these quick flash phrases as to politics. But the stuff that I post isn't really that easy to understand. Like, I do a lot of images, and people tell me all the time, despite saying the same message for a year now, that they're really confused about what I'm saying. But I'm still getting a lot of engagement from people because
are
they
you
feel it
saying?
intuitively.
Seriously, what's your like platform?
In Boston specifically, I'm arguing that resources are mismanaged because we spend so much time catering public dollars to the auto lobby. So that's parking spaces, the way that cars behave on our roads. If you go outside and you look at a pedestrian signal, pedestrian will have a signal, and a car will either block that crosswalk or they will go through it while they have a red light. Double parking everywhere, cars idling during rush hour. Just go onto Congress Street or off Congress Street. You'll just see how many cars are packed up. You go by one of the major busways, one of the major train stations here in Boston. That whole area is blocked off by cars. So I'm saying that our health is being torn apart to subsidize these vehicles. When you're breathing this in, you hear this noise at night, you can't sleep that well, you're not relaxing that great. All this space is taken up, and we can't have stuff like more tree cover. We can't have spaces like consolidated spaces for trash collection, which is something that Zoran Mamdani is doing right now in New York City. And it's something that I suggested to the sanitation department when I interned with them back during college. That's something that Boston could be doing here, but we don't have the willpower to take control from cars, whether that's commuters coming in from out of the city, which is another thing that I've suggested. I said that we could use congestion pricing to force compliance with the MBTA Communities Act. So if a neighborhood or a city wants to negotiate out of congestion pricing, they as an entire city have to vote to build more high-density housing and expand transit routes into their town or into the city, and then as a whole they can negotiate out of congestion pricing with the city of Boston. But that won't happen until the building actually starts. There's so many ways that you could be using these levers, specifically by controlling cars. The amount of material that these things consume, the amount of space they take up, all the oil, the cost that it takes every single month, like, it's just not sustainable. But people don't want to get rid of that or let go of that attachment.
I do want to sort of continue down maybe the transportation route and talk, or the housing route too. You had brought up housing, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to hear your thoughts on Massachusetts housing policy. Kunal, I know you ran for planning board in Lexington this year unsuccessfully. But tell me just a little bit about, in Lexington especially, a suburban affluent community, your experience of sort of being confronted with maybe the self-proclaimed liberals of Massachusetts who really are showing up in town politics as maybe far more conservative than they would say that they are.
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting dynamic, because I think it exists in Lexington, but I've also seen it expand further out, because, a huge thing. So I, even before and after, chaired the transportation committee, and a huge initiative for me was that Lexington adopted this, large scale of, compared to our neighboring towns especially, started correcting for its mistakes in history and adopted overlays to allow for multifamily housing in the town center and some of these core areas where it makes sense for people to live in condos, and people want to live in condos or apartments. And so when, working with that, I started trying to work with the MBTA on improving our bus infrastructure in lockstep with this housing that's coming in. And for a while, it was challenging, because a lot of people took this very one-dimensional perspective of, oh, Lexington's wealthy. You can just Uber to Alewife instead of taking this bus. But that only looks at one part of the equation. At the same time of Lexington being wealthy and a community that's incredibly hard to access right now, it is a community that struggles to hire for its service positions in the town center, for positions, for jobs in the community. And MBTA routes, bus routes, also bring people in and give access to these jobs and to these opportunities. And I built a coalition of people, especially from the economic development angle of things, to really sell this and really get the MBTA to buy in. And we ended up in the second round of bus network redesign improvements, because we were able to speed things up, move some things around, help, use some resources that were being, allocated in a different way, and get them to just get these bus routes in, like use the town's resources where it could, so that the MBTA could continue investing in other areas, but also make this improvement. I think those types of things where we're able to see direct improvement and get people access is huge. But at the same time, Lexington rolled back a really substantial portion of its overlay under this guise of fiscal responsibility, even when there wasn't any clear professional evidence that there was a reason to roll it back, which is a very odd, way of working about things.
How would you explain why that happened?
I think it was just people who have continuously opposed multifamily housing, who came in and used the guise of fiscal responsibility to say that multifamily housing is bad, or they used various, 1960s stereotypes to make their point, and they fear-mongered and really lobbied and forced their way into getting it passed. And I think we really have to make rational, careful decisions, because when we change zoning, we're impacting people's lives. And the zoning that was initially adopted was adopted with a number of, an amount of analysis done, and then the change was pretty rash, which created its own set of consequences. I'm not going to go into zoning freezes and chapter 40 of the general laws, but yeah, there's a lot there. And I think making sure that we can actually just implement things, because on the ground, we're seeing the first unit, the first building, the first condo building, it just had its opening ceremony, and we're seeing folks move into it. And I've talked to a number of constituents who've said that they were going to move to a cheaper community where they could afford the taxes, where they could, move away, but they would be further from their church. They would be further from their synagogue. They would lose access to those religious and community resources, their friends of like 30 or 40 years by moving away. But we were able to, with these condos, create an opportunity for them to move into a smaller home in the town, but stay as part of the community. And I think things like that really help every segment of the population. And I think that's, ties back to communication, because a lot of people think that it's just like a charity thing to build multifamily housing, but it's not. It's how you build a strong community.
Yeah, it gets to the heart of sort of what we're talking about on this show, of just like, what is the role of the government? What is the role of politics in today's society? And I want to zoom out before we wrap this up and ask you both to just sort of think ahead, maybe to 2028. Is there someone who, to your minds, is maybe going to fill that void, that it feels like there's a real void in the opposition party of the left?
I think it's far, far too early to name someone who will solve the issue that Democrats have right now. But I think the big thing is that the House is on fire, and we need people who are willing to pick up a bucket of water and start doing something. Even if they're doing it as an incumbent member of Congress, if they're running for Congress, if they are a city council member somewhere, if they're just attending a council meeting, if they are writing a letter, posting on Instagram. I think all of those points of engagement and influence are huge. We're seeing that in Boston, we're seeing it in New York City, we're seeing it in so many communities that I think that's something we really need to focus on. But then we need to elect people who are willing to fight, who are willing to do something, even if it's like a half step in the right direction. Get something done this week so we can keep doing something in the next year and the next 2 years. And I think that is huge. I think we just need people who are willing to move anywhere, somewhere. And then we also need people who I think are working with people who are willing to get things done. I think the whole thing of creating a cabinet that's really solving things. Phil Eng has done wonders for the T. I commuted into Cambridge for high school. When I started commuting, it was a 50-minute trip. When I graduated, it was 130 or an hour and 30 minutes. Yeah. And now it's back down to 55 minutes. And I think that's a huge improvement. And the frequency of the trip is faster. So I think things like that, where we're actually, developing solutions is important, and then communicating it out and elevating people who are willing to communicate it. I think Gen Z for Change did a lot in the 2020 election. Organizations that are really getting people involved and engaged in government are critical.
Alex, what are your thoughts?
Personally, I think that the only way for this nation to have a bright future where there's stability and there's like a sensible usage of power is for it to collapse, the federal government to collapse. And like I'm actually kind of banking on that. I think we need a new constitution that lays out the way that power is organized, how it checks itself, and how we ensure competence before people take on these roles. Obviously, that's not going to happen
Yeah, who
by
do you want to write
2028.
that new constitution?
So, I think AOC, I think she's looking pretty good now. Just seeing how she's kind of moving in the past few months as she's leading up towards it. I'd be excited to see her, even if she doesn't win, to make a campaign and kind of activate other young people to take steps to participate in local office. As you mentioned, that's where so much change can happen. And again, you can't always do everything you want at the federal level, but if you can change your local town boards, you can change your city councils, so much change can happen. And I hope that she does that for a bunch of people. She gets younger people, younger women, people of color, queer people. I want them all to get out and be inspired by somebody like her.
Kunal, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. Not My Politics is a new show from GBH News, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.